How indeed could one exact a service or any test of endurance from a man whom one had to let starve, in weather that froze his fingers if he left them exposed to the air? How make any dispositions whatever during an unceasing march, and when the staff officers have lost their horses and must go on foot to deliver the orders they carry? When all are crowded on to the same road and flanked by Cossacks who hardly let them get ahead out of their sight, there remained not a single brigade of cavalry in a fit state to cover our movements. The exhausted, unshod horses could go no further unless men dragged them by the bridle. Without drawing upon the guard, who were themselves much reduced, we had not sufficient cavalry to carry out a reconnaissance far enough or boldly enough to give us definite news of the enemy's position. Indeed, we did not attempt it, not even though the emperor had anticipated since the night before, November 13th, that the enemy were moving into action against us. We could not find a single peasant or man of any kind to act as guide. We had no means of information. Some detachments of Poles and of the guard were sent out to scout and returned after putting to the sword a few Cossacks whom they drove back upon a larger body, by which they were themselves obliged to retreat. They did not bring back a single Cossack to give us information about the troops in our neighborhood. Like men in close confinement when they are allowed to take the air, we could make no sense of what was going on around us. The emperor had remarked to us as early as Smolensk that the success of the Russians against Barangay-Dilié would go to their heads, and that Kutuzov would be forced out of his inaction. He was not mistaken, but the unity and solidarity conduct of the guard reassured him as to the consequences of an engagement of whatever kind it might be. As we approached Krasnoye, we came into contact with Miloradovic's army, which consisted of Osterman Tolstoy and Oyarovsky's divisions, with the addition of some cavalry, and which had taken up position near the village of Merlino on the left of the road. The Young Guard and the Dutch division of the Old Guard, under the command of the Duke of Treviso, were sent to oppose this force. They checked the Russians and held them off so successfully that our progress along the road was not interrupted. The emperor made for the place where this engagement happened, remaining there as long as things looked serious. Monsieur Giraud, my aide-de-camp, was mortally wounded by a bullet that hit him in the upper part of his thigh. At first, the emperor was inclined to believe that this attack was an offensive on the part of the whole enemy army. But Miloradovic's indecision and his withdrawal as soon as we took action persuaded him that it was merely the skirmishing of an isolated body of troops and was intended to harass and delay us while bringing the whole strength of his army against us. On first sighting of the enemy, the emperor had sent orders to Marshals Eckmühl and Elchingen to quicken their pace. He repeated these orders and made up his mind to stop his retreat until he had more certain information about Kutuzov's movements and about the movements of our own troops still in the rear. Reports about the enemy forces facing us indicated to the emperor that they were considerable. Reports reaching us from the lines of march proved that our communications were frequently being cut by Russian contingents. We even knew from information given by stragglers that villages on our left, at a short distance from the road, were occupied by enemy infantry. All these facts determined the emperor to stay at Krasnoye on the 16th and prepare for a battle. Convinced that the only way to drive the enemy off and prevent them from continually harassing us, and also to rescue his own troops in the rear, was by taking a vigorous offensive against the Russians, and thus proving to them that neither our courage nor our bayonets had been frozen, the emperor decided on a surprise attack by night. His first intention was to put General Rapp in charge, and he even gave him instructions. Later, however, he changed his mind. He entrusted the direction of the expedition to General Rouget, who attacked Yarovsky's forces 2 hours before daybreak on the 16th, killed or took prisoner most of his infantry and drove him as far as Luchino. This successful and daring action forced the enemy to withdraw, but the emperor, having gathered from prisoners that the whole Russian army was in the vicinity, decided to take the offensive, there being no other means of safeguarding the viceroy and the corps that followed after him. The emperor, who was in Plain with the troops, was uneasy about Prince Eugene's failure to arrive. His instructions had been to follow on behind us. But he had only been able to set out from Smolensk late on the 15th and had made contact with Miloradovich's forces drawn up for battle on the 16th. Stragglers thrown back onto his vanguard by this enemy force had been the first to inform him of its existence. The emperor knew from the sound of firing and from stragglers of the attack directed against the viceroy, whose delayed arrival made him uneasy. He ordered General Duranel, one of his aides-de-camp, to take 2 battalions of light infantry from his guard with 2 cannon and go ahead of him so as to help the viceroy make his way through. General Duranel, at the head of this body of troops commanded by General Boyer, had barely passed the emperor's rear guard emplacement when he came in contact with a horde of Cossacks who made off at his approach. He was marching to the left of the road in order to carry out his maneuvers more easily. Halfway to Kotova, he saw within cannon range a strong line of cavalry drawn up for battle on the other side of the road. Following suit, he formed his men into a square and fired a few cannon shots to find out the intentions of this force, which replied to his fire but took no other action. General Duranel, aware of the importance of the diversion he had been instructed to carry out and full of confidence in the veterans he commanded, had no hesitation in continuing with his march and leaving this body of enemy cavalry behind him. Having come within sight of the Russians, General Duranel had barely time to fire a round from each of his cannon and to form his men into a square when he was heavily attacked by cavalry and artillery fire. The cavalry vainly attempted to break up his formation. Their charges were repulsed with so much coolness as bravery. The enemy, however, were continually being reinforced and has spread over the whole countryside. It was thus impossible to delay a retreat without risking 600 men belonging to the guard, the only force left intact in the whole army. Duranel therefore began to retreat in good order. Although vigorously attacked and pursued for a league, he carried out his movement slowly and in so orderly a manner that at last the enemy cavalry ceased their attacks. Cannon fire cost him several men. He rejoined the army just when General Latour-Maubourg was setting off with his cavalry regiment under instructions to relieve him. The emperor, perturbed at the thought that a part of his guard was in action and cut off from the main body of the army, no reconnoitering parties sent out had been able to break through to General Duranel's contingent, was delighted at the safe return of this detachment. He was even more delighted at the arrival of the viceroy, who had been helped to extricate himself by the diversion created by General Duranel, and he invited him to supper, as well as the general, whom he praised several times. This turn of events, which upset all of the emperor's calculations, and which, if the enemy had had even a little determination, might on the lowest estimate have endangered all our troops in the rear, would have overwhelmed any other general. But the emperor was stronger than adversity. He became the more stubborn as danger seemed more imminent. Bracing himself against his bad fortune, he resolved to fight rather than abandon Marshals Eckmühl and Elchingen. He reiterated his earlier orders to quicken their pace. But was the road free? And if the orders reached them, would they arrive in time? The emperor had expected some sort of partial attack and could not understand the Russian tactics. Kutuzov would never make the mistake of following behind me along a devastated road if he had not some big project up his sleeve, the emperor told us. If Miloradovich had any kind of force at hand. He wouldn't have given way before a few battalions of the young guard. The distance between Junot and the rear guard, he added, is so great that it is impossible to give any real help. If we stop and wait, then there's nothing to eat. We risk everything, or rather lose everything, for we can't possibly gain our point in that way. How will we keep the troops alive? Now we've halted them. We've been here 24 hours already, and everyone is dying of hunger. If I take the offensive against the Russians, they will withdraw. I have wasted my time, and they will have got ahead of us. Notwithstanding these reflections, the guard had been ordered to move back along the Smolensk road. Strong batteries had been placed in position, and everything was prepared for a battle on the 17th. Although he had less than 20,000 men, the emperor had decided to come to grips with the enemy and was full of confidence in his old mustaches, whom he had doubtless kept in reserve for some such desperate venture as this. He had no doubts about his success, and he believed, as in happier times, that his luck would hold.